Before we dive into today's terrifying tale, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss a spine-chilling story. Let's get into it. Patient number 23.
I've always been drawn to abandoned places. There's something haunting about the stories they hold, forgotten in the dust and decay. When I heard about Willow Ridge Asylum, an old psychiatric hospital in a small, out-of-the-way town, I couldn't resist the pull. I'd seen photos, read the legends, shadowed halls, empty wards, and patients whose stories were left behind when the doors finally shut. That night, armed with my camera, I drove out, hoping to capture something extraordinary. As I pulled up to the hospital, a shiver ran down my spine. The building loomed, dark and foreboding against the night sky, its windows like hollow eyes staring back at me. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of mildew and rot, and yet there was a strange stillness that seemed almost unnatural, like the entire world had stopped to watch me take my first step inside. My flashlight cut through the darkness as I made my way down the main hall. The walls were peeling, and pieces of ceiling hung down in tatters. Every step echoed, almost as if the building were alive, responding to my presence. Old patient files lay scattered on the floor, most faded and smudged beyond recognition. I tried to imagine what it must have been like for those who walked these halls, those who lived here, trapped behind locked doors with nowhere to escape. Then I heard it. A faint sound, almost imperceptible, a creak from somewhere further down. I stopped, heart pounding, telling myself it was just the building settling, but the sensation lingered. I glanced over my shoulder. No one. Just my mind playing tricks on me, right? I forced myself to keep going, snapping photos as I went. I was about to enter a large room when I saw something unusual. It looked clean. There were no broken tiles, no graffiti, and the bed was made, sheets tucked in perfectly. A strange chill settled over me as I stepped inside. At the far end of the bed, a small metal plaque caught the beam of my flashlight. I walked closer, trying to make out the words. Patient number 23. I stood there, staring at the plaque. Patient number 23. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. The room was unlike any other I'd seen so far in this decaying, forgotten asylum. It felt preserved, as if someone had just left, planning to return at any moment. The bed was made, the blankets neat and undisturbed. There was even a small glass of water on the bedside table, perfectly clear and untouched. I lifted my camera, focusing the lens on the bed and the plaque. As the shutter clicked, I felt a strange sensation, like a cold breath on the back of my neck. I turned, half expecting to see someone there, but the room was empty. Just me, the silence, and that unsettling chill that clung to the air. I lowered the camera and checked the display. At first glance, everything looked fine. The bed, the plaque, the shadows of the room. But then I noticed something off. Right there, in the corner of the frame, was a figure standing by the bedside. A dark, blurry outline, barely visible but unmistakable. My heart skipped a beat. I looked around, scanning the room, but nothing had changed. There was no one there but me. Just that figure in the photo. My hands shook as I zoomed in, trying to make sense of it. I couldn't see a face, just a shadow with a vaguely human shape. I could have sworn I was alone in the room, but this figure, it felt real, like a presence lingering in the very air I was breathing. Swallowing hard, I took another step back, thinking it might be time to leave. I reached for the door, but the handle wouldn't budge. I twisted and pulled, my pulse racing, but it was locked tight. I couldn't remember closing it. In fact, I was sure I hadn't. The thought made my skin crawl. I pounded on the door, hoping someone might hear, though I knew no one was around for miles. The echo of my fists on the door seemed to fill the room, bouncing off the walls in a way that felt almost mocking. I stopped, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Then, from behind me, I heard the faintest sound, a soft, creaking whisper, like someone shifting their weight, right beside the bed. I froze. My eyes stayed glued to the door, my hand still gripping the handle, but every instinct screamed at me not to turn around. The creaking sound grew louder, filling the small room. I forced myself to breathe, each breath shallow and trembling as if the air had thickened with something I couldn't see. Finally, against every bit of common sense, I turned. The figure was there, standing beside the bed, no longer a blur or a trick of the light. It had formed now, a shape I could make out, though still cloaked in shadows. Tall and hunched, its shoulders seemed too broad, its arms too long. I couldn't see a face, just the darkness where one should be. But I could feel its eyes on me, and the intensity of that unseen gaze was almost too much to bear. I stumbled back, pressing my body against the door, the handle digging into my back. I raised my flashlight, but the beam flickered, dimming as if something was draining the life out of it. My camera dangled uselessly around my neck. My hands were too shaky to hold it steady even if I'd tried. "Hello," I whispered, my voice cracking, barely louder than a breath. The figure didn't respond. It only tilted its head, as if studying me with a quiet curiosity. I tried to tell myself it was a hallucination, a trick of the mind brought on by the darkness and the decaying air, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this thing, this patient, was real, that it had been waiting here all along. I felt a tingling in my fingertips, an icy numbness that seemed to crawl up my arms. It was as if the room itself was closing in on me, suffocating, like it didn't want me to leave. The figure took a single step forward, and I felt the floor creak beneath my feet, though I hadn't moved. I pushed harder against the door, my heart hammering in my chest, and tried the handle again. This time, it clicked. I fumbled to turn it, adrenaline pounding through me as I threw the door open and practically fell into the hallway. But when I looked back, I was met with something I hadn't expected. The room was normal, just another abandoned hospital room. The bed was unmade, the sheets tangled and covered in dust. No plaque, no glass of water, no patient number 23. It was as if the room had reverted to its true form, erasing all trace of what I'd just seen. I stood there, catching my breath, trying to make sense of it. But as I took a step back, something else caught my eye. A new message scratched into the door, freshly carved and stark against the peeling paint. It read, "You're not leaving yet." My legs felt weak, but fear propelled me forward, away from that cursed room and the message on the door. My mind raced as I tried to understand what I'd just seen. There was no rational explanation. One moment, I'd been trapped with an impossible figure. The next, the room was just another decaying, forgotten space. But that message scratched into the door. I couldn't ignore it. The corridor stretched out before me, dim and silent, its silence pressing in on me like a weight. I didn't dare look back, but every few steps, I heard a faint shuffle behind me. My mind told me it was just the echo of my own footsteps, but the sound was irregular, uneven, like someone was following, moving just a step slower than I was. I walked faster, my heartbeat pounding in my ears, each step echoing louder than the last. Just as I reached the main hallway, The air grew colder, so cold I could see my breath fogging in front of me. The lights from my flashlight dimmed again, flickering as if something unseen was draining their strength. My gut twisted with dread, but I kept moving, hoping I was close to the exit. I just needed to reach the doors, to leave this nightmare behind and never look back. Then, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone calling my name. It was faint, distant, but it was there, echoing off the walls. A low, rasping voice, as though someone was forcing the words from deep within their throat. My blood ran cold. No one knew I was here. I hadn't told anyone about my trip to Willow Ridge. Yet, the voice called my name again, closer this time, distorted and inhuman. Against every instinct, I turned around, and that's when I saw it. Patient number 23. The figure was standing in the hallway, just a few feet behind me, its dark silhouette somehow clearer, more solid than before. And it was coming toward me, moving slowly, deliberately, with a strange, unnatural grace. The shadows seemed to cling to it, swallowing the light around it, and its head was tilted, as if studying me with an eerie, patient curiosity. Panic surged through me, and I broke into a run. My footsteps pounded down the hall, echoing against the cracked walls, and I forced myself to keep moving, not daring to look back. Every time I rounded a corner, I caught a glimpse of the figure, always there, always moving closer, as if it knew every twist and turn of the asylum better than I ever could. The halls seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting and turning, leading me deeper into the maze of the hospital. I stumbled through rooms and corridors that felt familiar, yet strange, like the asylum itself was warping around me. My breaths came in ragged gasps, and my legs ached, but I couldn't stop. I knew, somehow, that if it caught me, I'd never make it out. Finally, I spotted a faint glow ahead, a dim sliver of moonlight seeping through a crack in the wall. The exit. I dashed toward it, heart racing, every nerve in my body screaming for escape. But just as I reached the end of the hall, the cold swept over me, sharper and heavier than ever before. It pressed down on me, a force I could feel in my bones, and the air became thick, suffocating. I turned to face the figure, knowing I had no choice. It was there, standing between me and freedom, blocking the hallway like a wall of darkness. Its head tilted again, and I swear I heard it whisper, soft, mocking, just one word: "Stay." I could barely breathe. The figure stood before me, an impenetrable wall of darkness that seemed to drink in the very air around us. I felt rooted to the spot, trapped between the icy stare of patient number 23 and the fading sliver of moonlight marking my only escape. "Please, what do you want?" I whispered, my voice trembling, half choked by terror. My words seemed to dissolve into the thick, frozen air. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to move, slowly, its shape shifting as it stepped closer, its movements unnatural and stiff, as if every joint protested its existence. I raised my flashlight, desperate to get a better look, to convince myself that this was some trick of shadows or a leftover mannequin used for medical training. But the beam of light only flickered and dimmed as it touched the figure, as if the very presence of this thing drained it of life. I took a step back, my body pressed against the wall, the cold from its surface seeping through me. In a last, desperate move, I lifted my camera, hoping to capture an image that might make sense of the nightmare. I raised it to my eye, and through the lens, patient number 23 was no longer a shadowy blur. It was a man with hollow, dark eyes staring straight into mine, his mouth twisted in a grimace of pain or rage. The name 23 was etched crudely into his forehead, the scars fresh and raw, as though he'd carved it there himself. My hands shook, but I pressed the shutter button. The flash fired, filling the corridor with a stark, white light. For a split second, everything was illuminated, and I saw him, really saw him. His hospital gown was torn, filthy, covered in blood, and he had scratches along his arms, deep and deliberate, like he'd tried to claw his way out of something. And his eyes, those hollow, dead eyes, bore into me, not with malice, but with an emptiness that chilled me to my core. Then, just as quickly, the light faded, and he was gone. For a moment, silence filled the corridor, an eerie calm as if nothing had happened. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath hitching. I scanned the hallway, expecting him to reappear, to come lunging out of the darkness, but there was nothing, only silence. I took a step forward, and then another, clutching my camera as if it were a lifeline. The moonlight was closer now, my escape within reach. But just as I was about to take another step, a sound broke the silence. A scratching, coming from behind me. Slowly, I turned, my heart hammering in my chest. Etched into the wall, where the figure had disappeared, were words scratched deep into the peeling paint, fresh and jagged, as if made by fingernails. "See you soon." I stumbled backward, unable to look away from the message. Every instinct told me to run, to get out while I still could, but something in those words held me there, rooted in place. Then, just as suddenly as the terror had begun, the air lightened, the oppressive cold lifted, and I heard the faint hum of traffic from the road outside. The hospital was just a building again, empty and decayed, like it had been when I'd arrived. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing through the hollow corridors. I burst out into the open air, the night breeze feeling almost painfully cold against my skin. My car was still there, waiting just as I'd left it. I climbed inside, gripping the steering wheel, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I didn't look back as I drove away from Willow Ridge. But when I finally stopped hours later, far from that cursed place, I dared to look down at the camera in my lap. My fingers trembled as I scrolled through the images. They were all there, clear as day. The hospital, the halls, the room labeled patient number 23. And then the final image. The man, his hollow eyes staring out of the darkness, the number etched across his forehead. As I stared at the photo, I could almost feel his eyes on me, a presence lingering, as if patient number 23 had followed me, embedding himself not just in my camera but in my mind, haunting every shadow I passed. I deleted the photo, but the feeling didn't leave me. And every time I close my eyes now, I see those words, "See you soon."
The final treatment.
I stood in front of the crumbling facade of St. Augustine's Psychiatric Hospital, the weight of its dark history pressing down on my chest. My heart raced as I remembered the stories my father had told me, tales of his years working here before he vanished without a trace. The hospital was now nothing more than a decaying relic, a haunted reminder of the past, but something compelled me to explore it. My fingers brushed against the rusted gate as I pushed it open, the sound of metal groaning echoing in the stillness. I took a deep breath, letting the stale air fill my lungs, and stepped inside. The dim light filtering through the shattered windows illuminated the dusty corridor, casting long shadows that seemed to twist and writhe. It felt like stepping into a different time, one where the cries of the forgotten echoed through the halls. I had received an anonymous letter just days ago. Its contents were cryptic, hinting at experiments conducted within these walls, experiments that my father had been a part of. As a psychiatrist, I knew how important it was to confront the past, but this felt different. I could almost hear my father's voice warning me to stay away from this place, but my curiosity was too strong to resist. The memories of my childhood flooded back to me. I remembered the late-night conversations where he would recount his work with patients, the breakthroughs, and the challenges, but there was always a darkness lurking beneath the surface. I had often wondered if those stories were meant to educate me or if they were warnings. Now, standing here, I felt a chill creep down my spine as I realized I was about to uncover the truth, whatever it might be. As I ventured deeper into the hospital, I could hear the faint whisper of the wind, mingling with the eerie silence. I raised my camera, capturing the peeling paint and cracked tiles, hoping to document my findings. Every shutter click echoed in the hollow halls, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. With each step, the atmosphere grew heavier, charged with an inexplicable energy. I could almost hear the whispers of the patients who once filled these rooms, their voices a distant murmur that sent shivers down my spine. I paused, looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see a figure watching me from the shadows. But there was nothing, just the oppressive silence. Eventually, I found myself standing in front of a door marked "Restricted Access." My heart raced as I pushed it open. The hinges creaked in protest, revealing a staircase that led down into darkness. A part of me hesitated, but the thought of discovering what lay beneath propelled me forward. As I descended into the depths of the hospital, the air became thick and musty, each breath a reminder of the decay that surrounded me. The faint sound of dripping water echoed in the distance, and I felt a cold draft pass through, raising the hair on the back of my neck. When I reached the bottom, I was met with a long, dimly lit hallway. The walls were lined with old patient rooms, their doors hanging ajar, revealing nothing but darkness within. I stepped cautiously, my camera at the ready, documenting the remnants of what once was. But as I continued, I noticed something peculiar. There was one room that seemed untouched. The door closed tightly as if it were guarding its secrets. Against my better judgment, I approached the door. My heart pounded in my chest as I raised my hand to knock. Just then, a whisper brushed against my ear, chilling me to the bone. I spun around, but the hallway remained empty. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was eerily preserved. A bed was made, the sheets crisp and white, as if someone had just left. On the bedside table lay a small nameplate, and I leaned in closer, squinting to read the faded letters. Patient number 23. A shiver ran down my spine, and I raised my camera to capture the unsettling sight. But as I looked through the lens, my heart stopped. There, standing beside the bed, was a figure, a shadowy silhouette watching me with hollow eyes. I stumbled back, dropping my camera, and the sound of it hitting the floor echoed ominously in the silence. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me in the room with patient number 23. Panic flooded my mind as I realized I was no longer alone, and the whispers grew louder, filling the space with a chilling sense of dread. I pressed my back against the wall, my heart pounding in my chest as I frantically searched for a way out. The figure beside the bed remained still, a dark mass that seemed to absorb the light around it. My breath quickened, and the air felt thick with an unnameable dread. I could hear the whispers now, indistinct and frantic, as if a crowd of lost souls were calling out to me, begging for release. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling in the heavy silence. The figure shifted slightly, and I felt a rush of cold air sweep through the room, causing goosebumps to rise on my arms. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot by an invisible force. Suddenly, the whispers crescendoed, echoing in my ears, and I pressed my hands to my temples, trying to block them out. They were no longer just murmurs. I could make out words, frantic and desperate. "Help us! Trapped! Not safe!" The voices seemed to intertwine with my thoughts, drowning me in their despair. I shook my head, trying to clear my mind. I had come here to uncover the truth about my father's past, not to be ensnared in a supernatural nightmare. But the room felt alive, the walls pulsating as if the very building was aware of my presence, aware of the darkness that lingered within. Gathering my courage, I turned my gaze back to the figure. It hadn't moved closer, but the shadows around it seemed to stretch and twist, reaching out like ghostly hands. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The air grew colder still, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. The figure finally stepped into the dim light, revealing a gaunt face with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through my very soul. It opened its mouth, but no sound came out, just more whispers that swirled around me. In that moment, I felt a connection, an overwhelming sense of sorrow and pain radiating from this lost soul. Suddenly, a vision flooded my mind, a scene from the past. I saw patients, disheveled and frightened, being led into the very room I stood in, their eyes wide with terror. I felt their fear wash over me like a wave, and I stumbled backward, trying to break free from the horrific memory. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me, demanding to be heard. We suffered. We were forgotten. The treatment never ended, I gasped, realizing that these were the voices of the patients who had once inhabited this place, trapped within its walls for eternity. Then, just as quickly as it began, the vision faded, leaving me gasping for breath in the dimly lit room. The figure remained, its eyes filled with an anguish that mirrored my own fear. It gestured towards the door, and I instinctively knew that it wanted me to leave, to escape this nightmare. But where would I go? I turned back to the door, my heart racing as I pulled on the handle. It didn't budge. Panic surged through me. I banged on the door, calling for help, but the only response was the echo of my own voice bouncing back at me. In desperation, I turned back to the figure. "Please, I just want to leave," I begged, my voice cracking. The figure's expression softened, and it stepped closer, extending a bony hand toward me. For a fleeting moment, I felt a rush of warmth, a promise of safety. But then, in an instant, that warmth turned to ice. I felt the shadows closing in, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. The whispers escalated into frantic cries, and I stumbled back against the wall, feeling the despair of those trapped souls flood over me. "Help us! Don't let it take you!" Their voices became a desperate chorus, a warning echoing in my ears. I felt my vision blur, the walls of the room twisting and warping around me as the shadows danced hungrily. I knew I had to fight. I couldn't let myself be consumed by this darkness. I closed my eyes, focusing on my father's face, on the warmth of his voice as he reassured me that I was safe. That memory was my anchor, and I clung to it as the shadows pressed in, suffocating me with their cold grip. "Stay away from me!" I shouted, summoning all my strength. I opened my eyes, staring defiantly at the figure before me. "I won't be one of you!" The figure hesitated, its form flickering as if my words had struck a chord. The whispers quieted momentarily, and I seized the opportunity. With a surge of adrenaline, I charged toward the door, throwing my weight against it. The door rattled but held firm. I pounded on it with my fists, panic surging through me. Just then, I heard a loud crack, and the door swung open. I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air, the overwhelming weight of the room lifting off my shoulders. But as I turned to flee, I glanced back. The figure stood at the threshold, its hollow eyes watching me, and I knew in that moment I had not escaped. Not yet. The voices still echoed in my mind, urging me to remember what I had witnessed, what lay hidden in the darkness. I stumbled into the hallway, my heart racing and my mind reeling from what had just transpired. The air was heavy with a damp chill, and the flickering fluorescent lights overhead cast eerie shadows that danced along the peeling walls. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart, but the whispers still echoed in my ears, haunting me with their cries. I had escaped the room, but the hospital felt alive around me. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant echo of footsteps sent shivers down my spine. I had to find a way out, but I knew deep down that I couldn't leave without uncovering the truth about my father's disappearance. What had happened here? What dark secrets lay buried in this forsaken place? Pushing aside my fear, I decided to explore the hospital further. I made my way down the corridor, each step feeling heavier than the last. The walls were adorned with faded photographs of past patients, their eyes hollow and haunted. I could feel their presence lingering in the air, their pain palpable as I passed by. As I turned a corner, I spotted an old nurse's station at the end of the hall. The desk was cluttered with outdated medical supplies and yellowed papers. A sense of urgency washed over me. I needed to find any information that could shed light on what had happened here. I approached the desk, my fingers trembling as I sifted through the papers, searching for anything related to my father or the notorious treatment he had spoken of. Suddenly, I heard it, a soft shuffling sound, like footsteps approaching. My heart dropped, and I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I glanced around the empty hallway, my breath hitching in my throat. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling, but only silence answered me. I turned back to the papers, my mind racing as I searched for answers. Amidst the scattered documents, I found an old patient file with the name, patient number 23, scribbled on the front. The notes were incomprehensible, filled with cryptic remarks and scrawled handwriting that hinted at unethical experiments and brutal treatments. My blood ran cold as I read about the final treatment designed to unlock the mind. The words sent chills down my spine. What had happened to these patients? What had my father uncovered before he vanished? Just as I was about to dive deeper into the file, a loud bang echoed through the hallway, making me jump and sending the papers flying from my hands. "Who's there?" I shouted, adrenaline surging through my veins. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as the shadows seemed to grow thicker, pressing in around me. The whispers intensified, a cacophony of voices crying out for help, drowning out my own thoughts. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest as I fled down the hallway. The sound of my footsteps echoed through the abandoned building, and I could hear the whispers growing louder, urging me to return. But I couldn't. I had to get out. I rushed through the maze of corridors, each turn leading me deeper into the darkness. I burst into a large room, the remnants of a common area scattered around me. Chairs were overturned, and the remnants of a long-forgotten game lay strewn across the floor. I caught my breath, my eyes darting around, scanning the shadows for any signs of movement. And that's when I saw it, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. I turned, my heart sinking as I saw a figure standing at the far end of the room. It was small and hunched, almost childlike, but something about it felt off. The figure's head turned slowly to meet my gaze, and I froze, paralyzed by fear. It was a child, but the face was gaunt, eyes hollow and sunken deep into its skull. It wore a tattered hospital gown, and a chill ran down my spine as I recognized it from the photos I had seen earlier. This was one of the patients from the old records. "Help me!" The child's voice came out as a raspy whisper, echoing through the empty room. I felt a rush of sympathy, but my instincts screamed at me to run. The shadows behind the child began to stretch and swirl, forming into shapes that flickered in and out of existence. "Get away from me!" I shouted, backing away from the figure. But it didn't move. Instead, it pointed towards a doorway at the back of the room, its finger trembling. "The truth. It's in there. You have to know." The whispers surged again, a chaotic chorus of voices urging me to listen, to follow the child. I hesitated, fear clawing at my throat. I had already come too far to turn back now. With a deep breath, I made my choice. I had to know the truth, no matter how horrifying it might be. I took a cautious step forward, my eyes locked on the doorway the child had indicated. The air grew colder as I approached, the whispers crescendoing into a desperate plea. I reached for the doorknob, my hand shaking, and with one swift motion, I pushed the door open. What I saw inside shattered my already frayed nerves. A dimly lit room lined with metal instruments, their surfaces gleaming ominously in the low light. Papers were scattered everywhere, each one filled with desperate cries for help, the words, treatment, and experiment echoing in my mind. In the center of the room stood a large table, stained and scarred from years of torment. I felt bile rise in my throat as I took in the horror surrounding me. This was where my father had been before he disappeared, the place where he had sought to uncover the secrets of the hospital's past. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me, echoing in the silence. I turned slowly, my heart pounding as I realized I was not alone. The door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside with the darkness. As I faced the shadows closing in, I knew I had stumbled into the heart of the nightmare. The whispers reached a fever pitch, and I felt the cold grip of terror as I realized the truth. I was not just an observer, I was now part of this twisted story. The room felt like a coffin, its oppressive atmosphere closing in around me as I stood frozen in horror. I could barely breathe as I turned to face the source of the footsteps. My heart raced, and I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. Shadows danced along the walls, twisting and curling like smoke as they moved closer, and I felt an icy dread wash over me. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice barely a whisper against the rising panic. I took a step back, instinctively seeking an escape, but the door had shut with a resounding thud, leaving me trapped in the chamber of horrors. The sound of my heartbeat thundered in my chest, and the whispers became a dissonant chorus, urging me to flee, to run from whatever lurked in the dark. Then I saw it, a figure emerging from the shadows. At first, it was just a silhouette, indistinct and wreathed in darkness. But as it stepped into the faint light, I felt a wave of recognition wash over me. It was the child from earlier, the one who had pointed me towards this cursed room. Its eyes, now wide and pleading, seemed to glow with an otherworldly light. "Help me," it whispered again, its voice barely a breath. "You have to help us." "Us?" I echoed, confusion and fear battling within me. "Who else is here?" The child glanced over its shoulder, eyes filled with dread. "The others. They won't let you leave. You have to remember, you're part of this. You have to know the truth." Before I could respond, a low growl reverberated through the room, and my attention was drawn back to the shadows. From the darkness emerged another figure, tall, gaunt, and wrapped in tattered clothes that looked like they hadn't seen a wash in years. My blood ran cold as I realized this was not a mere patient. It felt like something more sinister, a warden of the horrors that unfolded here. "What have you come to find?" it hissed, the words slithering from its lips like poison. "You're not supposed to be here. You're not one of us." I felt the urge to flee, but my legs felt like lead. The truth began to gnaw at my mind. I was here because of my father, but what did that really mean? What had he uncovered in this hellish place? "I'm not here to hurt anyone," I managed to stammer. "I just want to know what happened to my father. He worked here. He disappeared." The tall figure laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. "Your father was a seeker of truths, but he found only pain. This place is built on the suffering of those who came before you. The treatments were never meant to heal. They were meant to break. And you, my dear, are the next subject." As the figure advanced, I felt the chill of dread settle into my bones. The child reached for me, its small hand trembling. "You have to escape. They're coming for you." I snapped back to reality, adrenaline surging through me. With a burst of instinct, I pushed past the child and charged toward the door, pounding on it with my fists. "Let me out, please," I screamed, but the door remained immovable, as if mocking my desperation. Behind me, I could hear the figure laughing, a sound that sent chills down my spine. "You think you can escape the truth? You're already trapped in the web of your father's legacy." The whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a tempest, each voice begging for release, pleading for someone to hear their pain. I turned back to the child, its face etched with terror. "What do I do? How do I get out of here?" The child pointed towards the far corner of the room, where a small window, cracked and covered in grime, barely let in any light. "You have to climb. It's the only way. The truth is out there, but you have to leave now." Without hesitation, I sprinted to the corner, my heart racing as I grasped the window's edge. It was too small for an adult, but in my panic, I had no choice. I climbed onto the table, using every ounce of strength to pry the window open, the rusted hinges protesting with a screech. As I squeezed through, I could hear the figure behind me snarling, the shadows swirling with rage. "You can't run. You'll always be a part of this," it cried. But I forced myself to push forward, my heart pounding as I finally tumbled through the window and fell onto the ground outside. I landed hard, the cool grass beneath me a stark contrast to the horrors inside. I gasped for breath, taking a moment to gather my bearings. The hospital loomed behind me, a dark monolith against the fading light of day, and I felt the weight of its secrets pressing down on my chest. "Run!" The child's voice echoed in my mind, urging me onward. I couldn't linger. I had to get as far away as possible. With renewed determination, I scrambled to my feet and took off, sprinting through the overgrown grounds of the hospital. As I glanced back, I could see shadows gathering at the window, watching me with hungry eyes. The whispers swirled in my mind, warning me of the danger that still lurked behind those walls. But I had to find a way to escape. I had to uncover the truth about my father, about the experiments, and the twisted legacy that haunted this place. I ran until my legs burned, knowing that I had escaped the physical confines of the hospital, but the battle was far from over. As I reached the tree lanes surrounding the property, I paused to catch my breath, glancing back at the darkened building. I had no idea what I would find or what awaited me next, but one thing was clear: I had to go back. I had to confront the nightmare that awaited me inside. for the sake of my father and all the lost souls who had suffered here. The truth was waiting, and I was determined to face it, no matter the cost. I stood at the edge of the forest, my heart still racing from the escape, but the pull of the hospital was irresistible. I could feel the weight of the unanswered questions pressing down on me like a heavy shroud. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to dance with anticipation. I had to return. I had to confront the darkness that haunted this place and discover the truth about my father. As I made my way back through the twisted underbrush, a cold wind whipped around me, carrying with it a cacophony of whispers. Each step toward the hospital felt like stepping deeper into a grave. The air thickened with the scent of decay, and a sense of foreboding settled over me like a fog. I reached the building, its facade looming ominously against the darkening sky. The broken windows appeared like hollow eyes, watching my every move. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what lay ahead. I knew I wasn't alone. The memories of the lost souls echoed within these walls, urging me to discover what had happened to them, and to my father. I forced open the heavy door, which creaked in protest, echoing through the silent halls. The atmosphere inside was stifling, laden with a palpable sense of despair. My footsteps reverberated off the cold, sterile walls as I navigated the familiar corridors. I could almost hear the distant sounds of the past, laughter, screams, whispers, each noise wrapped in a shroud of madness. Following the instinct that had guided me before, I headed toward the basement, the site of my earlier terror. With each step downward, the air grew colder, and the darkness enveloped me like a cloak. I descended the staircase, feeling the presence of the spirits that had suffered in this wretched place. Their sorrow was a weight in the air, pressing against me, warning me of the horrors that awaited. As I reached the bottom, I found myself in the dimly lit room filled with dust and remnants of what had once been. Instruments lay scattered, instruments that had been used for torment and despair. The walls whispered secrets of pain, and I felt a chill creep down my spine as I surveyed the space. But what caught my eye was a door at the far end of the room, one I hadn't noticed before. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning me to enter. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. What lay beyond that door? Taking a deep breath, I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was small and bare, with a single chair in the center. My heart dropped as I recognized it, the same chair that had been in the photographs of my father's time here. It felt like a trap, a lure set just for me. "Welcome back," a voice purred from the shadows, sending a jolt of terror through me. I squinted into the dim light and saw the tall figure, the one from before, now fully revealed. Its gaunt face twisted into a smile that sent chills through my very core. "You've come to join us," it said, stepping forward, "to understand what your father never could." "Where is he?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "What did you do to him?" The figure chuckled, a sound like nails scraping against a chalkboard. "He sought the truth, just as you do. But the truth is a cruel mistress, my dear. He uncovered too much, and now he is part of the treatment." I stumbled back, my mind racing. "What do you mean? Where is he?" "Your father is here, trapped in the cycles of despair, just like the rest of us," it replied, its voice dripping with malevolence. "But you have the chance to save him, to take his place in the grand experiment. Will you embrace your destiny?" "No," I shouted, shaking my head furiously. "I refuse to be part of this madness." "Then you leave me no choice." Before I could react, the figure lunged at me, I dodged, my instincts kicking in as I sprinted toward the exit. The room erupted into chaos as the shadows began to swirl and twist around me, becoming animated with rage. The whispers grew louder, morphing into a cacophony of screams that filled my ears, urging me to escape. I burst through the door, sprinting down the corridor, fueled by a primal urge to survive. Behind me, I could hear the footsteps echoing, the laughter of the spirits following close behind. I ran faster, the cold air stinging my lungs as I raced toward the staircase. As I reached the top, I could see the exit, the light from the setting sun spilling through the broken door. I pushed through, desperation driving me forward, and burst outside into the cool evening air. But the shadows were closing in around me, their whispers mingling with the wind. "Come back," they cried, their voices weaving into an eerie harmony. "You cannot escape your fate." I stumbled and fell to the ground, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Panic flooded my mind, but I forced myself to focus. I couldn't let them take me. I had to keep moving. With a surge of adrenaline, I pushed myself back to my feet and dashed toward the tree line. I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of the woods, my heart pounding wildly in my chest. The shadows faded into the distance, but their whispers remained, echoing in my mind. I had escaped, but at what cost? My father was still trapped within those walls, and I knew I couldn't leave him behind. I had to find a way back, a way to confront the horrors of the past and rescue him from the darkness. As I looked back at the hospital, its silhouette looming in the twilight, I felt a sense of determination surge within me. This wasn't over. I would return, and this time I would face the truth. I would confront the past and fight for my father, even if it meant confronting my own fears. Because the truth, no matter how horrific, had to be uncovered, and I would not stop until I had set him free.
The empty chairs.
I never thought I'd be nervous starting a new job. I had just graduated nursing school, and the excitement of beginning my career was palpable. When I arrived at the small clinic on the outskirts of town, the building seemed unremarkable, almost charming in its quaintness. But as I stepped inside, I immediately felt an odd chill in the air, a subtle shift that sent a shiver down my spine. "Welcome aboard." My supervisor, Linda, greeted me with a warm smile. She had that calm, confident aura that made you feel instantly at ease. She showed me around the clinic, pointing out rooms and introducing me to my co-workers. Everyone seemed friendly enough, but there was a certain tension that lingered in the air, as if the place held secrets just beneath the surface. As the day wore on, I began to notice something strange. A few of the patients would glance nervously toward the empty chairs lining the walls of the waiting room, their expressions a mixture of fear and unease. When I asked one of the patients, an older man with a weary gaze, why he looked so troubled, he whispered, "You'll hear them soon enough. The chairs, they move." I chuckled nervously, dismissing it as one of the many delusions I'd read about in textbooks. "I'm sure it's just your imagination," I replied, trying to lighten the mood. But the man shook his head slowly, his eyes darting around the room as if he expected the chairs to spring to life at any moment. As night fell and my shift continued, the atmosphere shifted as well. I was left alone in the clinic, with only the distant hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional rustle of paper. That's when I heard it, a faint sound echoing through the hallway, like footsteps that faded before I could fully register them. I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks on me, but unease crept into my thoughts. Later, while I was checking on a patient in one of the rooms, I glanced back at the waiting area. One of the chairs had shifted slightly, facing directly toward me, as if it were observing my every move. My heart raced. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just the shadows playing tricks in the dim light. As I settled back into my office, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The chair in the corner, the only one facing away from the door, felt as though it were watching me. I took a deep breath and forced myself to focus on my notes, but the weight of that empty chair lingered in my mind. I told myself I'd get used to the oddities of this place, that it was all part of the job. But as the hours dragged on, and the clinic grew quieter, I couldn't shake the sensation that I was not alone. I glanced at the clock. Just a few more hours until my shift ended. Surely, I could handle that. But deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. The next few days at the clinic blurred together. Each shift brought a similar routine, but the whispers about the chairs grew louder among the patients. I couldn't help but notice the fear etched on their faces whenever they glanced toward the empty seats in the waiting area. Some would shift in their chairs, their bodies tense, as if bracing for something they knew I didn't. Emily, Mary, a nurse I had grown close to, said one evening during a break, "Have you heard the stories about the chairs?" I shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant. Just a few patients being superstitious, I'm sure. Mary leaned in closer, her voice low. "It's not just the patients. You'll see things, strange things. One of the chairs moved on its own the other night while I was cleaning. I thought I was losing my mind. My stomach twisted. I had started to notice things too. Late at night, when the clinic was quiet, I'd hear soft whispers echoing in the halls, and shadows seemed to dart just out of the corner of my eye. Once, while preparing medication in the supply room, I turned to find an empty chair positioned at the threshold, facing me. It made my heart race, but I brushed it off as my imagination running wild. As the days turned into nights, the unsettling occurrences became harder to ignore. One evening, after everyone had left, I was alone in the clinic again. I felt a chill seep into the room, and as I sat at my desk, I noticed the same chair from before. The one that always seemed to be watching had shifted slightly closer to my workspace. My hands trembled as I tried to convince myself it was merely an illusion. But then it happened. I was passing through the waiting area when I heard a soft scraping sound behind me. I turned to see a chair slowly gliding across the floor, moving by itself, as if pulled by invisible strings. My breath caught in my throat. I blinked, convinced I was dreaming, but the chair continued its deliberate journey, stopping only when it faced me, empty and inviting. "Okay, this is ridiculous," I muttered, trying to shake off the fear gripping my chest. I hurried back to my office, trying to focus on my paperwork, but I could feel it, an unseen weight pressing down on me, a palpable sense of dread that clung to the air. That night, as I prepared to leave, I decided to check the waiting area one last time. I forced myself to look, to confront whatever was happening. The chairs were all still, but as I turned to leave, I felt a chill wrap around me. The air grew thick, and I heard faint murmurs, indistinct words swirling like a whispering wind. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response, just the silence that followed, heavy and oppressive. I fled the clinic, heart racing, not stopping until I reached my car. As I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The shadows danced in the rearview mirror, and I swore I saw a figure sitting in the back seat. I glanced back, but it was only my imagination. Yet, the unease lingered, gnawing at my mind, echoing the words of the patients about the empty chairs that seemed to hold something sinister. This wasn't just a job anymore. It was becoming a nightmare. And I had a sinking feeling that the worst was yet to come. After a sleepless night filled with anxiety and dread, I returned to the clinic, my heart heavy with the knowledge that something was terribly wrong. I tried to brush off the events of the previous night, convincing myself that my imagination had run wild under the stress of the new job. Yet, the feeling that I was being watched was ever present, gnawing at the edges of my mind. As I settled into my shift, I decided I needed to understand what was happening. I approached Mary during our break, hoping she might share more about the stories that haunted this place. Mary, tell me more about the chairs. Why do the patients think they move? What happened here before? Her expression turned serious. You should really be careful, Emily. This clinic used to be a part of the old psychiatric hospital that was shut down. Some say it was haunted by the spirits of patients who never left. Haunted? I scoffed, trying to play it cool. That sounds like a myth. People have claimed to see things. Shadows, voices, chairs moving. The furniture we have here was all brought in from the hospital when they remodeled. You might be sitting in something that belonged to someone lost, she replied, her eyes wide with concern. Her words struck a chord within me, igniting a flame of curiosity and dread. After my shift, I decided to visit the abandoned hospital myself. I needed to confront the source of my unease. Armed with my camera and a flashlight, I ventured into the darkening night, the eerie silhouette of the hospital looming against the sky. As I approached the crumbling entrance, the air felt thick, heavy with the memories of those who had once walked these halls. I pushed the door open, and it creaked ominously, as if warning me to turn back. Ignoring the instinctual fear that gripped me, I stepped inside, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The interior was a ghostly shell of what it once had been. Dust hung in the air, and the faint scent of decay lingered, suffocating my senses. I walked down the long, empty corridors, my footsteps echoing ominously against the cracked tiles. I soon found myself in what appeared to be the main ward, where the walls were lined with peeling paint and rusted bed frames. And then I saw them, rows of old chairs, eerily arranged in a circle at the center of the room, just as the patients had described. My heart raced as I stepped closer, the silence amplifying the sound of my own breathing. I felt an inexplicable pull towards the empty chair in the center, as if it were calling my name. "Why are you here?" I whispered into the void, half expecting a voice to respond. Nothing but silence answered me. I snapped a few photos, feeling a chill creep down my spine with each click of the shutter. But as I turned to leave, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I whipped around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. The chairs stood silently, yet I could feel a presence in the air, something lurking just out of sight. Suddenly, the air grew colder, and the whispers began, soft, indistinct murmurs that felt like fingers brushing against my skin. Panic surged within me. I had to get out. I turned and sprinted down the hallway, my breath coming in ragged gasps. As I reached the entrance, the whispers intensified, swirling around me like a tempest. I burst through the door and into the night, stumbling as I fell to the ground outside. I looked back at the hospital, heart racing. The shadows in the windows felt alive, watching me leave, and I realized with horror that whatever was in there didn't want me to forget. I clutched my camera tightly, a tangible reminder of the darkness I had just escaped. But deep down, I knew I couldn't avoid this. The chairs, the whispers, they were a part of something much larger, something I had to uncover before it consumed me entirely. The next day felt like a blur. I couldn't shake the lingering dread that clung to me like a shadow, each moment weighed down by the memories of my visit to the abandoned hospital. My colleagues noticed my unease. Mary's worried glances only added to my discomfort. I could feel the walls closing in around me at the clinic, the whispers of the patients and the shifting chairs amplifying the growing sense of foreboding. Determined to uncover the truth, I delved into research about the old psychiatric hospital. The more I learned, the more horrified I became. The hospital had a dark history, filled with tales of neglect, cruel treatments, and patients who had vanished without a trace. As I scrolled through old articles and accounts, a name caught my eye. Patient number 23. Curiosity piqued. I dug deeper. I found references to a young woman who had been admitted for severe depression and anxiety. Her name had been lost in the annals of history, but rumors suggested she had experienced horrific treatments, subjected to isolation and electroshock therapy. The more I read, the more I felt a strange connection to her story, as if her pain echoed my own fears. I couldn't ignore the pull I felt towards the empty chair at the hospital. I needed to go back. I needed to confront whatever was lurking there. That evening, I returned to the hospital, this time with a resolve that drowned out my fear. As I stepped through the entrance once more, the air felt charged with energy. The darkness loomed around me, but I pressed on, flashlight in hand. The memories of the patient's stories echoed in my mind, fueling my determination. When I reached the main ward, the chairs were exactly as I had left them, silent, waiting. The empty chair in the center seemed to beckon me closer, and despite the fear thrumming in my chest, I approached it. My heart raced, pounding in my ears, and I felt a cold wind whip around me, sending shivers down my spine. Patient number 23, I murmured, my voice trembling. What happened to you? For a moment, nothing happened. The stillness felt oppressive, like the very walls were holding their breath. But then, the temperature dropped dramatically, and I felt a presence behind me, as if the air itself had shifted. I turned quickly, but again, I was met with emptiness. I gathered my courage and took a seat in the empty chair, a feeling of dread washing over me. As I settled in, the air around me felt heavy, charged with a palpable energy. I closed my eyes, trying to connect with whatever force lingered in this space. And then I heard it, a soft whisper, so faint I almost missed it. "Help me!" I jolted upright, my heart pounding in my chest. "Who are you?" I called out, the fear creeping into my voice. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a storm. "Help me! Find me!" The voice was desperate, filled with pain and sorrow, and it chilled me to the bone. Suddenly, a chair to my left scraped across the floor, moving on its own. I gasped, instinctively backing away. In that moment, I realized the chairs weren't just empty. They were filled with the memories of those who had suffered here, trapped in a cycle of despair. "Show yourself!" I shouted, my voice echoing off the walls, desperation fueling my words. As if in response, the room began to flicker with dim light, shadows dancing along the walls. In the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of a figure, pale, ethereal, and haunting. It was the outline of a woman, her features obscured by shadows, yet the sorrow in her presence was unmistakable. "Help me! Escape!" the voice pleaded, and I felt the weight of her despair pressing down on me. With newfound determination, I knew what I had to do. I had to uncover the truth about patient number 23 and release her from this torment. I wouldn't allow her story to fade into oblivion like so many others. I had to help her find peace, even if it meant confronting the darkness that lingered in the shadows. My heart raced as I stared at the ghostly figure before me, the air thick with the weight of her sorrow. "How can I help you?" I whispered, fear and determination battling within me. The woman's presence seemed to waver, flickering like a candle in the wind, but the desperation in her eyes anchored me to the moment. "Find my name," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising tension in the room. "They took it. They took everything." A surge of urgency coursed through me. I had to uncover her identity, the truth that had been buried alongside her memories. The feeling of being trapped pressed down on me, an oppressive reminder of the horrors that had unfolded in this very place. As the whispers intensified around me, I remembered the old records I had stumbled upon in my earlier research. The hospital had kept meticulous notes on its patients, documenting their treatment and circumstances. If I could just find that archive, I could bring her name back to light. "I'll find it," I promised, my voice stronger than before. "I'll find your name and make sure you're not forgotten." With a sudden jolt, the air shifted again, and the figure seemed to nod, her expression a mix of hope and despair. In that moment, I understood that I wasn't just there for myself. I was there for her, for all the lost souls who had suffered within these walls. I bolted from the ward, my mind racing with plans. The clinic had a few archives of its own, old documents that had been saved from the hospital's closure. I raced back, heart pounding, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Each step felt like a leap towards redemption, not just for me, but for her. When I arrived, I rifled through the papers, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. I found what I needed: old admission records, notes scribbled in fading ink. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages, searching for the name of the patient I had felt so deeply connected to. And then I found it: Lillian Grace, patient number 23. The words leapt off the page, and I felt a strange warmth envelop me. This was it. This was her. I quickly jotted down the information, my heart racing. "Lillian Grace," I whispered to myself, testing the name. "You are not forgotten." As I gathered the papers, I felt a sudden gust of wind, and my breath caught in my throat. The whispers returned, but this time they were softer, more melodic, as if relieved. I knew I had to return to the hospital, to call out to her one last time. Once again, I stepped into the darkness of the old psychiatric hospital. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, and as I entered the main ward, the chairs stood as silent witnesses. The empty chair in the center seemed to shimmer with energy, and I took my place within it, holding the paper tightly in my hands. "Lillian Grace," I called out, my voice steady. "I know your name now. You are Lillian, and I promise you will be remembered." The air around me shifted, and the ghostly figure materialized once more, her expression transformed. The despair in her eyes was replaced with a glimmer of hope. "Thank you," she whispered, and for the first time there was peace in her voice. As I spoke her name again, I felt the energy in the room swell, a warmth enveloping me. The chairs began to move slightly, almost as if they were acknowledging her presence. "You can go now, Lillian. You're free." The shadows swirled around us, and in an instant she was gone. A rush of wind swept through the room, and I felt an overwhelming sense of relief wash over me. The whispers faded, replaced by a serene silence. I realized then that Lillian's spirit had been set free, her name restored to the world. I left the hospital that night, the darkness no longer suffocating but instead filled with a sense of closure. The memories of those who had suffered there lingered, but I knew I had done something important. I had faced my fears, confronted the past, and helped a lost soul find peace. As I stepped into the cool night air, I felt lighter, as if a burden had been lifted. I looked back at the hospital one last time, a silent promise on my lips. I wouldn't forget. Lillian Grace, patient number 23, would always be remembered.